It's a week. Hi there, it's Stephen and Anne.
At breakfast from 6 a.m, you'll always be caught up with everything you need to know. The latest headlines, opinions and debates.
We'll bring you the good news and the bad, but most of all, we're here for you.
Remember, send in your views and let us know what you would like us to talk about.
That's because we're your news channel. And every morning at 6 a.m, it's breakfast on GB News.
I'm Dan Wootton. Join me Monday to Thursday from 9 to 11 for the feistiest and most fun news debate on TV, where free speech reigns. I'll bring you a sharp take on the day's biggest stories, bombshell newsmaker interviews, and A-list guests. And I guarantee you, no spin, no bias, no censorship, and no reason to go to bed. That's Dan Wootton Tonight, Monday to Thursdays from 9 on GB News.
My name is Andrew Doyle. Join me every Sunday evening at 7 p.m. for Free Speech Nation. This is a show where we address current affairs and news stories of the week with the help of two wonderful comedian panellists. I brought in comics because I want to give it a lighter edge, and also they work for less. See you there.
Good morning, I'm Greg Dewhurst and welcome to your latest broadcast from the Met Office. Tuesday is going to be a bright day. There'll be plenty of sunny spells, but there will be some scattered showers and exceptionally mild for the time of year once more. Looking at the pressure pattern, low pressure continues to dominate over the next few days. Showers or longer spells of rain, particularly in the west, accompanied by some strong winds. Further east, be drier at times with some sunny spells. Through Tuesday itself, well, the morning is looking largely dry. There'll be some bright or sunny spells. There will be a few showers from the word go, but most places will stay dry as the morning progresses. A few more popping up across southern England into the afternoon. And then later on, we'll see a band of heavier rain, stronger winds moving in across parts of Devon and Cornwall. Winds coming in from the south, so a mild direction, 14 to 19 Celsius across the UK, well above average for this time of the year. Through into the evening, outbreaks of rain continue to push northwards through the Irish Sea, affecting parts of Wales. Then later on, Northern Ireland, southern Scotland into the early hours, but clouding over across much of the UK. The winds picking up, starting to gust near gale force towards the Irish Sea. And as a result, it will be a mild night, 13, 14, 15 Celsius for many of us, well above where they should be. Bit of a cloudy, windy start to Wednesday morning, but as the morning progresses, we'll start to see some bright skies developing. Showers will push their way quickly north and eastwards. Most persistent across northern parts of Scotland, some heavy rain for a time here. But into the afternoon, plenty of sunny spells developing, a few heavy showers and staying quite blustery, but temperatures rising in the best of the sunshine, 20, 21 Celsius, well above where they should be. Feeling warm for the next few days as well. We will see some rain at times, particularly in the west, the best of the sunshine in the east with some blustery winds, and those temperatures 19, 20, 21 Celsius over the next few days.
Good morning, this is To The Point on GB News with me, Anaya Falarin-Inman and Tom Harwood on your TV, radio and online. We're with you until midday with a show jam-packed with today's biggest stories, lots of discussions, expert guests and our opinions as well as yours.
Yes, so make sure you get in touch with your views. As usual, gbviews@gbnews.uk is the address. We'll be getting to those throughout the show. But first, here's the latest headlines.
Good morning, it's 10 o'clock. I'm Tamsin Roberts in the GB newsroom. Rishi Sunak will be appointed as the country's next Prime Minister, replacing Liz Truss when he meets King Charles this morning at Buckingham Palace. The former Chancellor won the Conservative leadership contest yesterday after his only remaining rival, Penny Mordaunt, withdrew from the race. Mr Sunak has ruled out an early general election despite calls from opposition. Well, you can watch Ms Truss's speech live here on GB News shortly at around 10:15am and Mr Sunak's speech at around 11:35am. Conservative MP and former Justice Minister Victoria Atkins says Mr Sunak will try to unite the party.
He has said to my colleagues, to us as a parliamentary party, look, we've got to get together to fix these problems for our country and for our constituency. And in fairness to Rishi, you know, the endorsements and the support that he gained over the weekend from all corners of the Conservative Party, I think really does show that we all, as members of Parliament, want to pull together. We want to focus.
Well, Liz Truss held her last cabinet meeting this morning at number 10 Downing Street. Jeremy Hunt says he does not yet know if he will remain as Chancellor. MP Andrew Bowie expects Mr Sunak's cabinet will be diverse.
The Conservative Party is a very broad church, drawn from different traditions and different parts of the country, and I think we're going to see a cabinet that represents that, and that's a very good thing. If one thing we have learned from the past months is that you cannot build your cabinet around purely whether or not they supported the individual who is now the Prime Minister, or that they come from the same ideological background as the Prime Minister.
President Joe Biden has welcomed Mr Sunak's appointment, saying the UK's first British Asian Prime Minister was a groundbreaking milestone. The White House says they look forward to working with number 10 and that President Biden would call Mr Sunak after the incoming PM had met with the King and appointed his cabinet.
We've got news that Rishi Sunak is now the Prime Minister. As my brother would say, go figure. And the Conservative Party expected to become the Prime Minister, I think, tomorrow when he goes to see the King. Pretty astounding.
New figures show the price of low-cost everyday grocery items like pasta, tea and cooking oil have soared. The Office for National Statistics says budget items have increased in cost by around 17% over the last 12 months. It comes as inflation is at a 40-year high, with prices up 10.1% in a year. Food prices drove the latest rise in living costs in September, along with energy bills and transport costs. Royal Mail workers are striking today for 24 hours in a long-running dispute over pay and conditions. It's the latest in a series of industrial action taken by members of the Communication Workers Union. The CWU says its Royal Mail members have had an unagreed 2% pay deal imposed on them at a time when inflation is in double figures. An investigation is underway after 2 men have been killed in a shooting in London. Officers were called to Henley Road in Ilford in the early hours of this morning, following reports of a fight and shots being fired. They found 3 men with gunshot injuries. A man in his 20s was pronounced dead at the scene, while another died a short time later. The 3rd victim was taken to hospital and remains in a critical condition. No arrests have been made. About 25% of the sun will be blocked by the moon this morning as it passes between it and the Earth in a partial solar eclipse. People across the UK will be able to see the phenomenon, with sky gazers in northern Scotland expected to have great views of it. The eclipse is expected to begin shortly and come to an end just before noon. This is GB News. We'll bring you more news as it happens, of course. Now it's back to the point.
Good morning, this is To The Point on GB News with me, Tom Harwood, and Inayat Lauren Iman on your TV, radio and online. We've got a great show for you today, lined up with so much stuff to kickstart your day, including, of course, our new Prime Minister. That'll come in the next couple of hours.
Yes, just on that topic, new leader Rishi Sunak will meet with His Majesty King Charles this morning, where he will be formally appointed as Britain's new Prime Minister. We'll bring you Liz Truss live from Downing Street very shortly as she steps down today.
And the state of the economy is still a persisting problem with not only our country, but also the Western world. With inflation hitting double figures, a housing crisis and indeed possible recession looming, what will our new Prime Minister do to fix this?
Yes, and with many calling for a general election, will Rishi Sunak be able to maintain the support of voters in the Red Wall constituencies? What policies can we expect from the new Conservative leader?
We've got all that coming up and much, much more. Of course, those live events too across this programme. You can get in touch through it all with your views as usual. gbviews@gbnews.uk is the address.
new leader of the Conservative Party, Rishi Sunak, will meet with His Majesty King Charles this morning, where he will be formally appointed as Britain's new Prime Minister.
Yes, we're expecting to hear from the outgoing Prime Minister Liz Truss in the next few moments. She'll make her last statement outside 10 Downing Street from her peculiar Jenga-like lectern.
Well, before we hear from Liz Truss, let's hear from our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, who is outside Downing Street. Thank you for joining us, Darren. Just tell us, what is the latest?
Yeah, very good morning, guys. Here we are again. A bit like deja vu. The street is full of hundreds of journalists. The lectern is out. The motorcade is to my left-hand side. The MPs and staff who supported Liz Truss are also at this end of the street, ready, frankly, to say goodbye to her, as we are expected to hear, as you say, in the next couple of minutes from Liz Truss, Britain's shortest-serving Prime Minister, Britain's third female Prime Minister. She did have cabinet this morning. We saw them all troop in at just before 9. I reckon it must have lasted for about 15-20 minutes, very much like her tenure, i.e. it was short. They have now left, many of them wondering, of course, whether they will keep their jobs into this afternoon. Just to talk you through, though, the choreography of what's going to happen this morning. In the next, 5-10 minutes or so, we're going to hear from Liz Truss at that lectern, making her last speech to the nation as Prime Minister. She's then going to get in her car, travel down Whitehall to the Mall and then up to Buckingham Palace, where she's going to tender her resignation to King Charles there. And then the new leader of the Conservative Party, Rishi Sunak, will also enter that room as Liz Truss exits, and he will accept the invitation from His Majesty the King to form a new government. He will then travel back here to Downing Street as Prime Minister, and he will address the nation as Prime Minister for the first time, and it's just after 11:35 a.m. we reckon. Unlike last time, which was only 7 weeks ago, when, of course, the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson had to travel to Balmoral and Liz Truss had to travel back and it was pouring down with rain. We are expecting this all to happen on time today.
And
this looks like...
Darren, I'm just going to interrupt you there because the King is currently leaving Clarence House. He's on his way to Buckingham Palace. We're just seeing pictures there of King Charles III driving in his rather splendid classic car the short distance to Buckingham Palace, which we can actually see there from our camera's position. Clarence House, of course, very, very close to Buckingham Palace. Buckingham Palace undergoing renovations, which is why King Charles III is not living there as his main address. He's using it as his office. So King Charles there now inside the gates of Downing Street, of Buckingham Palace, I should say, ready to receive Liz Truss once she does resign. So there we go. We can see that car just driving round that famous roundabout there outside Buckingham Palace, the roundabout which has an enormous statue of Queen Victoria, our second longest serving monarch. And there it goes, swinging round. Quite a few crowds, actually, this morning for a Tuesday morning. Of course, a lot of excitement going on in Buckingham Palace, an address that has seen so much excitement over the last few weeks. Well, there we go. The King is now inside the gates of Buckingham Palace. Darren, apologies for that brief interruption there, an important journey for us to witness. But back to you, what's the mood like on the street? How close is the Prime Minister to walking out that shiny door?
Very, very close indeed. And I don't know if we can show you the pictures from the pool pictures that we've got access here to GB News of what is happening in the street, because just coming out of number 11, you may remember, Tommy, you and I were here last time, weren't we, when it was pouring down the rain. Therese Coffey, there you go, she is on the right-hand side, the Deputy Prime Minister outside number 11 Downing Street. She's just turned up and said, thank God it's not raining, as it was last time. But I do not suspect that those are the people who work and have worked for Liz Truss inside number 10 over the last couple of weeks, couple of months, almost couple of months. And I did not I don't think one of them suspected that they would be leaving quite so soon. I was actually just thinking this morning, you can see the podium there, as you said, the Jenga podium in the middle of the street. So we are expecting to hear from the Prime Minister imminently. Is that, Liz Truss will have moved her stuff, her family, her husband, her children into Downing Street only a matter of weeks ago, and yet this transition is having to happen again. It is quite extraordinary, and it is an historic day today. Not only do we say goodbye to Britain's shortest serving Prime Minister, but we do say hello to one of its youngest, the youngest since 1812. Its first of Indian heritage, the first non-white Prime Minister this country has ever seen. Potentially even its wealthiest Prime Minister. Suggestions that Rishi Sunak and his family are wealthier than even the King himself. So it really is quite a moment. But more than that, quite extraordinary that we are back here yet again. We are expecting to hear from Liz Truss. I suspect it'll be a rather brief statement. There we go. That is the speech being put on the podium. That, of course, not Liz Truss herself. That is the speech. So that is a sign that it really is quite soon. I suspect a bit like last Thursday, these will be very, very brief remarks indeed from the outgoing Prime Minister.
Yes, it's interesting. When Boris Johnson had his parting farewell address, it did go on for more than 10 minutes. It was a wide-ranging speech, from everything from policy going forward to looking back to Roman consuls. Cincinnatus was mentioned, of course, and so much more. He described being ejected like booster rockets from a space shuttle and touching down somewhere in the Pacific Ocean. I'm not sure we're going to quite get that verbosity from Liz Truss today.
Well, no, just by the simple fact that, let's be honest, Tom, she's only been Prime Minister for 7 weeks. And, you know, a big chunk of that was obviously having to deal very tragically with the Queen's death. And much of the rest of the record is something that, frankly, I'm not entirely sure even she is terribly proud of. So, in the end, there's not an awful lot, let's be honest about this, for Liz Truss to say. So, yes, I do suspect it will be quite short. The big question is, I'm not entirely sure what she is going to do next. I suspect she is not going to be someone who is likely to serve in a Rishi Sunak government. She will return to the backbenches. But beyond that, you know, will she remain as an MP? Will she go on the Speaker's circuit? But again, I'm not entirely sure there will be that many people who will want to hear from her, given the fact that she was in office for such a short period of time. If you can hear some revving in the background, that is the motorcade bikes getting Prime into position so that they can escort the Prime Minister's car to Buckingham Palace for that last time. And we all do essentially wait here to hear from what the Prime Minister has to say. But in the end, she will make that journey to Buckingham Palace for the last time. And then we await the new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, here in the streets.
Darren, please tell us a little bit about what else is going on that street. You said that the Deputy Prime Minister, Theresa Coffey, over there by number 11. When Boris Johnson resigned, there was a gaggle of supportive MPs on the other side of the street as well. Do we see that today?
Yes, there are, Tom. Slightly out of shot. You cannot catch them because they're on the other side of the camera, on the other side of the street this time round. But yes, I can see I'm looking directly at Jacob Rees-Mogg at the moment. There are quite a few Conservative MPs and indeed special advisors have gathered at the other end of Downing Street from where you are looking right now, who have come to say goodbye to Liz Truss. I can see Giles Dillnop, for example, who was or is a special advisor to the current Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly. The problem is we do have to remember, you know, there is a massive human aspect in all of this as well, Tom. These are people who have got jobs, who will have given up jobs actually to take jobs. And I say that because, you know what, they may well be out of employment again this afternoon. And we do have to remember politics is a brutal game. I think there is no doubt that Liz Truss could not sustain herself in office, but many of these people would not have thought that her tenure would have come to an end quite so quickly. And as I say, we do have to remember that irrespective of what happens today and all the pageantry and the protocol and the comings and goings and the talk that we will get into later on about who will be in and out of the cabinet, you know, these are people's livelihoods, these are people's jobs, and for many of them, this may be the last time that they do work in politics, and this will be an emotional day for them to say goodbye to a leader that they believed in, that they trusted, that they wanted to see succeed, but frankly in the end didn't. And so it will be a tough day for many of the people currently that you can see in shot here in Downing Street.
Seeing this
And so we will
shot.
wait and see what happens.
Yes, it's so interesting seeing this particular aerial shot. We get to see so much more of the street than normally that fixed position shows. Of course, it's not just number 10 and 11, but we can see at the back there number 12, where the Whip's office has recently been moved. Of course, if the camera were to swing round the other way, we would see
Here
number
we go,
9
Tom.
Downing
Here we
Street
go,
as well.
Tom. Here we go. Here's the Prime Minister.
It has been a huge honour to be Prime Minister of this great country. In particular, to lead the nation in mourning the death of Her late Majesty the Queen after 70 years of service, and welcoming the accession of His Majesty King Charles III. In just a short period, this government has acted urgently and decisively on the side of hard-working families and businesses. We reversed the national insurance increase. We helped millions of households with their energy bills and helped thousands of businesses avoid bankruptcy. We are taking back our energy independence, so we are never again beholden to global market fluctuations or malign foreign powers. From my time as Prime Minister, I am more convinced than ever that we need to be bold and confront the challenges that we face. As the Roman philosopher Seneca wrote, it's not because things are difficult that we do not dare. It's because we do not dare that they are difficult. We simply cannot afford to be a low-growth country where the government takes up an increasing share of our national wealth and where there are huge divides between different parts of our country. We need to take advantage of our Brexit freedoms to do things differently. This means delivering more freedom for our own citizens and restoring power to democratic institutions. It means lower taxes so people can keep more of the money that they earn. And it means delivering growth that will lead to more job security, higher wages, and greater opportunities for our children and grandchildren. Democracies must be able to deliver for their own people. We must be able to outcompete autocratic regimes where power lies in the hands of a few. And now more than ever, we must support Ukraine in their brave fight against Putin's aggression. Ukraine must prevail, and we must continue to strengthen our nation's defences. That's what I have been striving to achieve, and I wish Rishi Sunak every success for the good of our country. I want to thank Hugh, Francis, Liberty, my family and friends, and all the team at Number 10 for their love, friendship and support. I also want to thank my protection team. I look forward to spending more time in my constituency and continuing to serve South West Norfolk from the backbenches. Our country continues to battle through a storm. But I believe in Britain. I believe in the British people. And I know that brighter days lie ahead. Thank you.
There we have it, Liz Truss walking away from that podium in Downing Street in a speech which quoted Seneca and indeed spoke about returning to the backbenches, campaigning for freedom too. Darren McCaffrey is in Downing Street for us. Darren, your thoughts?
Yeah, really interesting that. First of all, we talked, didn't we, a little earlier about what she would say in that speech and how short it would be given her short tenure and the fact that there weren't, frankly, many successes. She did touch upon a couple of them, which was getting rid of the national insurance rise, though there have been speculation that Rishi Sunak may well impose that, but clearly that did get through Parliament. It was something that had cross-party support. And on the energy price freeze as well, she felt that that was a very significant announcement. I thought what was most interesting though, Tom, and I don't know whether you agree with me or not, essentially she was defending her kind of the ideological position that she'd taken. She was defending the reason that she as she admitted herself, had gone too far and too fast, that Britain needed to be bolder, that these things are difficult, they're not easier, and was actually in some ways, I thought, firing a shot across Rishi Sunak's bow, if you like, in saying that as Conservatives there should be lower taxes, that people should have more freedoms. And I think, given frankly the difficult position that Rishi Sunak may well find himself in, that those options may not immediately be open to him. So I thought it was really interesting that in many ways she was leaving or stating very clearly her position as a Conservative, what she thinks it should be, which is, you know, lower taxation, more freedoms. Will the new Prime Minister be able to achieve that? And finally, we got a sense of what she's going to do next, which is essentially, seems, remain as an MP and work from the back benches. But in the end, you know, there is no sense, is there, that this was a great statesman-like speech. And that has been Liz Truss' big Achilles heel, I think, and I, to a large degree, in the sense that she's not the world's finest public speaker, which I'm sure she would admit herself.
Well, thank you so much for bringing your reaction. Our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, and I'd very much agree. There was some defiant statements there by the outgoing Prime Minister, Liz Truss. She still talked about low growth, pro-growth, low tax, competition and daring to do things differently. So she is still maintaining and defending the positions that she took. Well, we're now going to go to our home and security editor, Mark White.
Yes, Mark is on the Mall for us, awaiting that convoy. Of course, a very short journey from Downing Street across up to the Mall and then down to Buckingham Palace. I wonder if we can go to Mark now. Mark, are you with us?
Oh, yeah, here we go. Yes, these journeys are always anxious times for those in charge of the VIP security detail, because everyone, of course, knows in advance that this is an event that's happening. I'm just going to pop out of the way because we're told that the first of the motorcade outriders are now coming down the Mall here. Interestingly, in the speech there at number 10, first time I've ever heard the Prime Minister, when giving thanks to obviously her family and staff, to thank her close protection detail as well, which was a nice point, because the work of these men and women of the close protection detail often goes unrecognised, but they're there day in, day out, keeping these VIPs safe. You can see now the convoy of Liz Truss just passing our position, coming down the Mall and heading down towards Buckingham Palace for that audience with His Majesty the King, as he takes his first resignation from a British Prime Minister. And then, of course, a few minutes after that, he will appoint his first new Prime Minister. It was, of course, the duty of his late mother not that long ago to take and to appoint Liz Truss to that role. It was, but that, as I say, affords now the new king, very soon into his office, the ability to appoint his first Prime Minister, Prime Minister Rishi Sunak, who will have an enormous task in front of him as he tries to steer this country back onto a path again of economic growth and prosperity.
I'm going to be a bit facetious here, but when the Prime Minister resigns, there'll be a few moments before the new Prime Minister is appointed when we are Prime Minister-less as a country, when executive power, instead of resting with a Prime Minister, rests with His Majesty the King.
Well, interestingly, a few people have been saying maybe that's the way that we need to go, given the turmoil that we've been experiencing the last few months. So some people might be welcoming that, I don't know.
Well, speaking of executive power resting with the King, let's turn to our royal reporter, Cameron Walker, who is there outside Buckingham Palace for us. We got a glimpse of him earlier as we were just watching that car swoop in. Cameron, what will the King be, what are the formalities, what's the protocol here today?
Well, it's a very well-practiced tradition, Tom, of the King appointing the new Prime Minister. It's one of the few personal prerogative powers that the King still holds, appointing his new PM. Liz Truss has just gone inside Buckingham Palace to formally tender her resignation. Of course, Liz Truss was the Prime Minister when the King became King. She was heavily involved in the Accession Council, where the King was formally proclaimed our sovereign, and perhaps because it is, of course, his first Prime Minister, the King will continue to have quite a special relationship with Liz Truss. But nonetheless, we are expecting the new leader of the Conservative Party, Rishi Sunak, to follow in Liz Truss's footsteps to Buckingham Palace when Liz Truss departs. He will travel for an audience with the King at Buckingham Palace, where the King will ask him formally to form a government in his name. He is the leader of the party with a majority of seats in the House of Commons, and therefore can command the confidence of the House. Now, Rishi Sunak and the King have worked together before. It was in May when Rishi Sunak was Chancellor and the King was the Prince of Wales. They supported young people at a Prince's Trust initiative, which is one of the King's former charities, through the UK government's Kickstart scheme. And no doubt they'll be working together over the next couple of months. They'll have a weekly audience together. Of course, we're never privy to exactly what is said within those meetings between the King and his Prime Minister. And I predict in just a month's time, Rishi Sunak will be heavily involved in the upcoming state visit of the South African President, hosted by the King and the Queen Consort at Buckingham Palace. We're expecting that at the end of November. But for now, the King is going to be appointing his new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak.
It's interesting, we saw the King himself drive to Buckingham Palace just around half an hour ago. He's not actually living in Buckingham Palace at the moment. Why is that?
No, he's not. He's living at Clarence House. Buckingham Palace is in the middle of a 10-year refurbishment programme. It's about 5 years into it. There are, in parts of Buckingham Palace at least, still scaffolding everywhere, but Buckingham Palace is still very much the home of the British monarchy in terms of the business. It's perhaps used, for want of a better phrase, an office for His Majesty the King to carry out state business like appointing his new Prime Minister, like hosting receptions. So he spends a lot of time here, His Majesty the King, but of course his home where he lives, his private time, is currently at Clarence House. There are rumours, there is talk that he will eventually move into Buckingham Palace with the Queen Consorts, but it will be perhaps after the renovations are completed, which is scheduled for 2027.
And one of the things that Liz Truss mentioned in her final speech just a moment ago was that she oversaw the transition of the monarchy from the late Queen Elizabeth to King Charles. I mean, that is something incredibly significant in the history of this country that at least Liz Truss can take with her.
Oh, indeed. It was literally 7 weeks ago exactly that Britain's longest reigning monarch appointed what turned out to be Britain's shortest serving Prime Minister. And it was just 2 days after that Her Majesty the Queen passed away at Balmoral Castle. Liz Truss spoke to the nation on the day of Her Majesty's death outside the steps of Downing Street, and then, as I mentioned earlier, was part of the Accession Council, a very important constitutional role, and also travelled to all 4 nations in the United Kingdom to attend services of thanksgiving for Her Majesty the Queen's reign, something, of course, the King also did. She also did a reading at Her Majesty the Queen's state funeral inside Westminster Abbey, and I think perhaps that is going to be one of the lasting legacies of Liz Truss's quite short premiership.
Assuming that Rishi Sunak lasts longer than 50 days as Prime Minister, something else that he'll be involved in, of course, is the coronation of the new King, expected to take place next year. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, the coronation in May, the first time since we've had a coronation since the 2nd of June 1953. It will almost be 70 years to the day that Her Majesty the Queen was crowned inside Westminster Abbey. Of course, the Prime Minister is expected to take a big part in that, but I think one of the headaches for Buckingham Palace over the next few months is just how much money they decide to spend on the coronation. As we have been talking about for months now, Tom, we are in a cost of living crisis here in the United Kingdom, and I think it's going to be a fine balance between keeping the traditions, keeping the pomp and the ceremony which Brits love about this country, but also being mindful of the fact that some people in this country are having to choose between heating and eating. So perhaps spending millions of pounds on a coronation, on the crowning of a sovereign, will not go down too well with certain members of the public. There's been no official confirmation at all as to what form the coronation will take place, but when Buckingham Palace released the date of the coronation, they did say that it would reflect modern Britain. Quite what that means, we'll have to wait and see for further details, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was a much shorter service than we saw in June 1953 for the Queen's coronation, because that lasted for around 3 hours, and perhaps the robes which people wear within the coronation, things like that, which add an expense, will not be seen. But in terms of the crowning, the anointing within that official ceremony at the coronation, that I'm sure we will see.
So much for all of that royal news as we await to see what happens next at Buckingham Palace. Thank you for joining us here on To The Point. Well, it's interesting looking at exactly what's going on, because Liz Truss has been in there for quite some time now. I wonder what on earth they're talking about.
Oh, God. I mean, as Cameron mentioned, it is significant insofar as, you know, this was the first Prime Minister that King Charles had to deal with. So maybe there is a relationship there that's kind of deeper and more meaningful, and it must be a very emotional time for her. But yes, we are waiting for her to leave Buckingham Palace when that will be the case.
It's not just us waiting. I'm sure Rishi Sunak is there tapping his foot thinking, when on earth is she going to get out? So that he can finally drive in as well. Well, when that does happen, we will bring you every single second of it. But before then, we're going to have a look at some of the latest news headlines.
Hello, it's 10:33. I'm Tamsin Roberts in the GB newsroom with the latest. Liz Truss has bid farewell to Number 10, saying it has been a huge honour to be Prime Minister. In her final speech from Downing Street, she says her government had acted urgently and decisively as she spoke of cutting taxes. Ending her speech, she said brighter days lie ahead.
It has been a huge honour to be Prime Minister of this great country. In particular, to lead the nation in mourning the death of Her late Majesty the Queen after 70 years of service, and welcoming the accession of His Majesty King Charles III. In just a short period, this government has acted urgently and decisively on the side of hard-working families and businesses. We reversed the national insurance increase. We helped millions of households with their energy bills and help thousands of businesses avoid bankruptcy.
Well, Rishi Sunak will be appointed as the country's next Prime Minister when he meets King Charles this morning at Buckingham Palace. The former Chancellor won the Conservative leadership contest yesterday after his only remaining rival, Penny Mordaunt, withdrew from the race. Mr Sunak has ruled out an early general election despite calls from opposition. And you can watch Rishi Sunak's speech on GB News at around 11:35 this morning. President Joe Biden has welcomed Mr Sunak's appointment, saying the UK's first British Asian Prime Minister was a groundbreaking milestone. The White House says they look forward to working with Number 10 and that President Biden would congratulate Mr Sunak once the incoming PM had met with the King and appointed his cabinet. New figures show the price of pasta, tea and cooking oil has soared, with vegetable oil going up by 65% in a year. The Office for National Statistics says the lowest price grocery items have increased in cost by around 17% over the last 12 months. It comes as inflation is at a 40-year high, with prices up 10.1% in a year. TV, online and DAB+ radio, this is GB News.
Weekday afternoons on GB News, we've got the whole of the UK covered. From 12 to 3, it's GB News Day with me, Mark Longhurst.
And me, Gloria Di Piero. You'll get the very latest on everything that's been going on across our great nation.
And from 3 till 6, watch out for GB News Live with me, Patrick Christys. I'm not here to mess around. With all the biggest topics and guests, you will always be up to date. GB News Day and GB News Live from 12 p.m.
Only on GB News.
The People's Channel, Britain's news channel.
Hello there, it's Eamon Holmes here from Breakfast on GB News. We're not just on your television and your screens, you know.
We're on DAB plus digital radio, so you can listen to your favourite shows on the move.
If you've not yet listened to GB News Radio, it's very simple. We're on your radio player and TuneIn apps, on your smart speaker, phone or tablet, or online at gbnews.uk.
Take us with you wherever you go. GB News Radio.
You never have to miss a moment of the People's Channel.
Join my show Farage, 7 p.m. till 8 p.m. Monday through Thursday. And there you will get opinion, analysis, debate, and I'll cover stories that nobody else dares to touch.
You've been cancelled. Join the club.
Oh, my goodness me. And then for the last 15 minutes, talking pints. We're over a drink. We have a civilised conversation with someone. We very often disagree, but we do it in a grown-up way. Come and join me on Farage.
Hello, I'm Simon Evans. Join me on GB News for Headliners at 11 p.m, where I'll be joined by two of the country's top comedians as we take a look at tomorrow's newspapers tonight. If it's a big story, we'll be covering it, I guarantee, but we'll also have some fun along the way. That's GB News Headliners at 11 p.m. We won't put you to sleep, unlike some of the other paper review shows out there. So join us, 11 p.m, 7 nights a week.
It's 10:37. This is To The Point on GB News with me, Anaya Flaren-Imman and Tom Harwood. We're live on your TV, online and radio this morning.
Yes, well, the so-called Red Wall broadly describes former Labour constituencies that switched to the Conservatives in their landslide victory under Boris Johnson in 2019. Many of these seats switching for the first time.
Well, will Rishi Sunak be able to maintain the support of voters in Red Wall constituencies, and what policies will he likely pursue to do so? Joining us now to discuss this in more detail is Will Tanner, Director of Onward, a Conservative think tank and former Deputy Head of Policy for the former Prime Minister Theresa May. Thank you for joining us. I mean, what do you make of some of these questions we are asking? For many people, many commentators, they're saying that levelling up, for example, is dead. And many of the polls show that there is a strong resurgence of the Labour Party in those constituencies. I mean, what do you make of this?
Well, good morning, Anaya. The position that Rishi Sunak inherits in the Conservative Party is pretty desperate. I think we need to be honest about the scale of the challenge before him and recognise just how steep the hill is that he has to climb. The Conservative Party is around 36 points behind the Labour Party. That's worse than at any point since 1997. And in our report that we published yesterday, we found that just 39% of 2019 Conservative voters say they would vote Conservative if there was an election tomorrow, with 35% of voters rating their chance of voting Conservative at 0 out of 100. So a really difficult situation. However, I think there are positives. Ultimately, the only way from here is up. Rishi Sunak can only improve on what should be the nadir for the Conservative Party. But to do so, he will need to focus on the policies that can win back those voters, particularly in the Red Wall, who have moved away from the party in the last few years. So that means focusing on what we call a kind of national conservatism that won in 2019. That's focusing on economically interventionist policies. They're going to make markets work for people. So not the kind of deregulation that we've heard about for the last 6 weeks. And socially and culturally conservative policies on things like crime and immigration. That's what will win back the voters the party has lost.
Manifesto that did win all of these seats. This was a manifesto that promised to keep taxes low, that promised to not increase national insurance, that decried the Labour Party's idea of raising corporation tax, that said corporation tax being low was a good Conservative value. To some extent, are we over-interpreting the 2019 manifesto, which was actually quite a low-tax document?
Well, the 2019 manifesto promised to keep taxes low, but it did not promise the type of unfunded tax cuts that we've heard about in the mini budget from Kwasi Kwarteng just a few weeks ago. It promised fiscal discipline as well as low taxes, and it promised economic competence of the type the Conservatives have historically been known for. So I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that that document was different from the type of conservatism that Liz Truss promised in the last few weeks. In fact, I think the departure has been from her government rather than necessarily from Boris Johnson. So I think no, I'm not sure that is the correct interpretation. The other thing that that document very clearly set out was things like curbs on immigration. It promised to reduce lower skilled immigration, that overall migration would fall. Obviously, from Liz Truss, we heard a desire to increase migration. That would have worried many 2019 voters. And it recognised that sometimes markets don't work properly and the government needs to be there to step in, as it did during the pandemic. So I think the 2019 manifesto is the blueprint for Rishi Sunak's government, and he's made very clear that he wants to deliver on it.
And what about the question of trust? I mean, whether many of these Red Wall voters can really trust the Conservatives over the last few years. I think many of them feel that they've been catastrophically let down. And I'm personally not somebody that brings people's background too much, but I have heard discussion about the fact that, Rishi Sunak is the richest man in Parliament and so on and so forth. I mean, can he really connect to these voters in the way that perhaps would really bring them along?
You're absolutely right that trust is critical. One of the biggest barriers to voters coming back to the Conservative Party is the fact that they think of them as dishonest, untrustworthy, not delivering the promises that they've made. So a return to a government in service of ordinary working voters is essential if the Conservatives are going to rehabilitate their reputation. I personally don't think that Rishi Sunak's background is necessarily material here. I think what voters will judge him on is his actions. It wasn't Liz Truss's background, it was her actions that put off a load of voters. And I think what we need to see from Rishi Sunak is a government that makes decisions on the basis of the entire country rather than just some portions of the country, and rebuilds trust through competence rather than through big radical policy change.
And yet, Will Tanner, in terms of saying that this is that the prognosis for success must be to intervene more in markets, the largest single thing that Liz Truss did in her short tenure as Prime Minister was intervene in the energy market in a large, unfunded and indeed untargeted energy intervention that could have cost up to £200 billion. It was an energy intervention that was actually criticised by the World Bank for its untargeted nature and no doubt led to some of that market instability. So to some extent, is there a warning there in terms of intervening too much in markets, leading to market instability, leading to a rise in gilt yields, a fall in the value of the pound, stuff that then really affects individuals and households?
So, Tom, I think you're right that how the nature of the intervention, how you intervene, really does matter. We've actually been quietly critical of the untargeted nature of that energy price freeze because it was entirely untargeted and in some ways encourages people to use energy when they could be conserving it, and it benefits the richest households most. So I do think that that is legitimate criticism. We've heard from Jeremy Hunt that he plans to target that intervention next year. I think that's a good thing. But that doesn't mean that there isn't a role for government in supporting good outcomes in a market economy. And I think most people, including most people in business, would say that there is a role for setting the guardrails for markets to ensure that people benefit from the proceeds of growth.
Then, just going forward then, in order to really respond to some of the things that you're talking about, crime, immigration and so on, isn't who is in the cabinet going to be key then? Because we've had other people like Suella Braverman who, resigned from Liz Truss cabinet and so on. Is there many people in the potential Rishi Sunak cabinet that will actually care about and be interested in dealing with the kinds of things that you're talking about?
I think there are an enormous number of leading Conservatives who get this agenda and who are willing and capable of delivering it in government. So if you look at people like Michael Gove, an extraordinary effective delivery minister in all of the departments in which he's served as cabinet minister, whether that's levelling up, whether that's education, whether that's environment, whether that's the cabinet office. He is a great example of someone who I would absolutely like to see brought back to the front bench. But there are others too. There are great people who've never served in the cabinet before, people like Vicky Atkins, who've been brilliant as a minister for domestic abuse and violence against women and girls, who deserves a chance at sitting at the top table. So I think there are lots of people capable who do get this agenda. Rishi Sunak is not short of talent on the backbenches.
So looking at those potential names that have been floating around, it's interesting you mention Michael Gove. Of course, he's been out of cabinet since the summer. He's been causing a lot of mischief on the backbenches while he's been out of cabinet. Perhaps it's safer to have him in the tent rather than outside. But some other names that are doing the rounds: Oliver Dowden, Dominic Raab, Robert Jenrick, Mark Harper, Liam Fox. Do you expect, Will Tanner, that we're going to see a big influx of all of these supportive names of Rishi Sunak?
I think what's likely is that Rishi Sunak will want to appoint talented, proven ministers to his top team and to have a breadth of talent from across the parliamentary party. It's clear that he has understood that one of the mistakes of the last few weeks was to have a cabinet chosen largely for loyalty rather than necessarily for their track record. And so I would expect his party to be quite diverse, to have people from different wings of the party, but people who have proven themselves at the top tier of government. And that is a good thing, because one of the biggest challenges the Conservatives face is just competence, just delivering on the 2019 manifesto and delivering for voters in the national interest. That's critical for the period ahead.
Well, thank you so much, Will Tanner, Director of Onward and former head of Number 10 policy under Theresa May. Thank you so much for joining us. I think that was a really important point that Will made in terms of if the cabinet being people that have a proven track record versus people that are loyal, because I think in that sense, then the focus is on delivery, not just a kind of insular conversation that's quite defensive many of the time.
It's interesting looking at some of those members of the cabinet that we've seen for the last 7 weeks. Some of them have not been MPs for very long. Some of them have not been in levels of government for a particularly long time. And yet, because the party in one form or another has been in government since 2010, there are lots of people on the backbenches who have a lot of that experience. It will be interesting to see who is brought forward, who returns to cabinet. Again, I say that Liam Fox and Mark Harper are some of those names that are doing the rounds that potentially could come back. But we're going to be talking a little bit more about the economic side of things now. After all, it was potentially the markets that did most to bring down Liz Truss. We'll be going to the economic side of things in just a moment. But, of course, Liz Truss has bid farewell to Number 10, saying it's been a huge honour to be Prime Minister. In her final speech from Downing Street, she said her government had acted urgently and decisively as she spoke of cutting taxes. Let's remind ourselves of what she said.
It has been a huge honour to be Prime Minister of this great country. In particular, to lead the nation in mourning the death of Her late Majesty the Queen after 70 years of service, and welcoming the accession of His Majesty King Charles III. In just a short period, this government has acted urgently and decisively on the side of hard-working families and businesses. We reversed the national insurance increase. We helped millions of households with their energy bills and helped thousands of businesses avoid bankruptcy. We are taking back our energy independence, so we are never again beholden to global market fluctuations or malign foreign powers. From my time as Prime Minister, I am more convinced than ever that we need to be bold and confront the challenges that we face. As the Roman philosopher Seneca wrote, it's not because things are difficult that we do not dare. It's because we do not dare that they are difficult. We simply cannot afford to be a low-growth country where the government takes up an increasing share of our national wealth and where there are huge divides between different parts of our country. We need to take advantage of our Brexit freedoms to do things differently. This means delivering more freedom for our own citizens and restoring power to democratic institutions. It means lower taxes so people can keep more of the money that they earn. And it means delivering growth that will lead to more job security, higher wages, and greater opportunities for our children and grandchildren. Democracies must be able to deliver for their own people. We must be able to outcompete autocratic regimes where power lies in the hands of a few. And now more than ever, we must support Ukraine in their brave fight against Putin's aggression. Ukraine must prevail, and we must continue to strengthen our nation's defences. That's what I have been striving to achieve, and I wish Rishi Sunak every success for the good of our country. I want to thank Hugh, Francis, Liberty, my family and friends, and all the team at Number 10 for their love, friendship and support. I also want to thank my protection team. I look forward to spending more time in my constituency and continuing to serve South West Norfolk from the backbenches. Our country continues to battle through a storm. But I believe in Britain. I believe in the British people, and I know that brighter days lie ahead. Thank you.
Yeah, we just heard from the outgoing Prime Minister, Liz Truss. Let's now go to our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, who is in Downing Street. Thank you again for joining us, Darren. I mean, it was still quite a defiant speech, as you mentioned earlier. She's still defending her record in relation to low taxes and pro-growth. And some people may say that she was intuitively right about the orthodoxy needing challenge, but maybe her approach wasn't the one that people wanted.
Yeah, it's definitely defined, and there's no doubt about that. When she talked about the policies, she essentially tried to enact the political philosophy, as you say, behind those policies. It was almost Johnson-esque, I would suggest, in the sense that, you know, there was no apology. There was no sense of, I'm going to admit I got things wrong here. I mean, there was even quoting that Roman philosopher talking about how it's not just because things are difficult that we do not dare, it's because we do not dare that they are difficult. But I think, frankly, there'll be a lot of people watching that speech, given what has happened over the last, 4 or 5 weeks or so, with the fall in sterling, the rise in mortgage rates, the real political and economic instability, thinking, well, frankly, I'm sorry, Liz Truss, you're going to have to own up, admit and apologise for those mistakes. But you're right, there was just no sense of that at all in the speech. If anything, there was a reiteration that she felt she was right. Even at the end, she didn't get to go much further in her role as Prime Minister, and almost a challenge, I would suggest, to Rishi Sunak, saying that those conservative values of low taxation and individual freedom need to be held to, knowing full well that actually he is in a tricky corner and may not be able to do either of those things, not least of all because of the mess, frankly, she has left the incoming Prime Minister. So really fascinating. She did touch upon what she viewed as her successes, limited as they were, in managing, of course, the tragic death of the Queen, into the funeral arrangements, and the government's role in that, and also the intervention when it came to the energy price freeze, though that intervention, the initial one of 2 years, was part of the reason we got into trouble in the first place. So a very defiant speech, one that didn't recognise that she'd made any mistakes. One, though, with her family watching behind her husband and her 2 daughters, and a sense that she is going to return to the backbenches and potentially carry on as an MP, because frankly at the moment, stood here, and you guys were talking about it just now, weren't you, the speculation about who might be in and out of the cabinet under Rishi Sunak. I cannot see Liz Truss being offered a job, if I'm honest. I'm not entirely sure she would accept one either, but I'm not entirely clear about what her role in politics may well be. Is there a comeback for Liz Truss? I don't know. Is she prepared to sit on the backbenches like Theresa May particularly after such a short tenure. We're going to have to wait and see. But she, I think, should be about wrapping up, you would have thought, with His Majesty the King. She will go back to life, not like she's seen it before, because she has been a cabinet minister for a very long period of time. So she will return to the backbench. She's not been there for years and years and years. We'll see what political course she tracks for herself in the weeks and months to come. And we here in Downing Street await, of course, the arrival of the incoming Prime Minister, an historic moment for Britain. We're expecting to hear from Rishi Sunak in over just 30 minutes' time or so.
Yes, really, really interesting to think that, of course, Liz Truss has been in cabinet since the time of David Cameron, since the time of actually the coalition government. Really extraordinary tenure there, coming to an end likely today. It was interesting listening to her words, though. It sounded not only defiant, but it sounded as if this is someone who still has a fight to participate in, that she will be an active backbencher. I can imagine her potentially taking up a role as a president of a think tank or something, and popping up with ideas on economic policy and being really active in terms of pushing forward that low tax, high growth agenda. I should just say now, I'm hearing that Liz Truss has officially submitted her resignation to His Majesty the King. She is, as of this moment, no longer Prime Minister. Darren, potentially an active backbencher life now awaits.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think in these very brief moments we have, we remember this, don't we? We get used to these kind of protocols that technically at the moment, I mean, the King really is in charge of the country, though it is only for those brief moments while Rishi Sunak takes over in, as you say, the next 5 minutes or so. Yes, in terms of what I think Liz Truss, there were two really interesting things in the speech where I think she might be a thorn in the side, if you like, a voice who is going to continue to propagate that political ideology of hers about substantial supply-side reforms and lower taxation to spur growth. First of all, was in that political philosophy that she very forcefully put forward. But second of all, on Ukraine, she was quite defiant that Ukraine needs to win and that we need to continue to support Ukraine with defence spending in the months and years to come. And of course there is a big discussion, isn't there, whether Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister, the new Prime Minister, is going to commit himself to that 3% of GDP of defence spending by the end of the decade. It's going to be 2.5% by 2026. There are loads of suggestions, given the state of the economic situation in the country, about whether the government can frankly afford that. She was making clear the country should be committed to that defence spending. So yes, I suspect that she will continue to be quite vocal from the backbenchers, potentially a thorn in the side of the new incoming Prime Minister. Also interesting that she did leave with the remark that there are brighter days ahead for the country. And frankly, there'll be many of our critics thinking, yes, there will be, given the fact that you're leaving Downing Street. I'm not entirely sure it was wise to use those words, given the fact that, there will be relief among many, it must be said, many voters, but also Conservative MPs, that she is leaving Downing Street today. We must not forget that. She is leaving because she's been essentially booted out of the office as one of the most unpopular Prime Ministers this country has ever had, and the shortest Prime Minister this country has ever had.
Well, thank you for bringing us the latest developments, our political editor, Darren McCaffrey. I think it is an interesting point about what she'll be doing next, because I guess some people would think, well, do we really want to hear her speak about, leadership and so on, given that she didn't necessarily last as a leader? So I don't know if that would be part of her plan.
Well, let's now go to our Home and Security editor, Mark White, who is on the Mall for us, waiting, I suspect, for Rishi Sunak's car, now that we know that the Prime Minister has formally resigned, now that we know that the King has formally accepted her resignation.
And as you say, just those few minutes really until he will appoint his first Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Just seeing one of the police outriders from the Metropolitan Police Special Escort Group, those officers who are tasked with escorting the very important motorcades. Now, Rishi Sunak, of course, as Chancellor, will have been used to a security detail, but that is stepped up very significantly now. He will, wherever he goes, be escorted either by the Special Escort Group of outriders and a phalanx of other vehicles or with, depending which part of the country is, their equivalent to the special escort group. Now this, obviously the Mall is the preferred route that we know that the motorcades will go down to Buckingham Palace, and it's always a point of concern for those that are working out the security around these VIP movements, because everyone knows effectively that this is happening today. It is a state occasion in that sense, so that just ramps up how the planning for the security will have to be on point, as it always is. And as I say, this is something that Rishi Sunak will now enjoy throughout his term in office as he prepares to take on as Prime Minister that very difficult job in the midst of course, an economic crisis in this country, with a war raging in Europe, with a cabinet who've just been effectively freshly appointed. What does he do is the big question now about this cabinet going forward. Do we see a third Home Secretary in as many weeks? We've got Grant Shapps, of course, as Home Secretary at the moment, but he's, of course, got to deal with a big issue of concern, the migration crisis, in terms of all these small boats, up towards 38,000 already this year, which is 10,000 more than for the whole of last year. It was something that Suella Braverman said she would get to grips with. She didn't have time. Something that Priti Patel, during her time in office, failed to get to grips with. The numbers just continued to grow while she was in office. Well, we know that Grant Shapps, like his new boss, is still wedded to the Rwanda plan, but that is going nowhere fast because it's still mired in these legal challenges at the Royal Courts of Justice, and we're expecting the High Court in the coming weeks to make a decision on whether this Rwanda policy is actually legal, and that's something that the new Prime Minister can actually wholeheartedly embrace as a way of trying to solve this crisis.
Thank you so much for bringing us that, and please do give us a shout as soon as you see the first hint of a little motorcade from either the former Prime Minister or the Prime Minister-to-be. We will return to you very, very swiftly. Well, Mark, thank you there on the Mall. But let's now turn to economics. Of course, Rishi Sunak is best known for being the Chancellor during the pandemic. But how does a former Chancellor go to be Prime Minister? I'm delighted to be joined by Liam Halligan, our economics and business editor. Liam, what will Rishi Sunak's big economic in-tray, how will that mould his premiership?
Well, the first thing he's got to do really is calm down the financial markets, and there's sign that that's already happening. I have to say, I agree with Darren that Liz Truss's exit speech, if you like, whereas sort of Theresa May's was "I'm sorry" and Boris Johnson's was "see you again soon." Liz Truss's was "I was right." I'd push back a little bit on Darren. I understand that at Westminster she's seen as a complete failure, but there'll be a lot of people out there in business saying that she was right to keep the corporation tax at 19% rather than increasing it to 25%. And she was right to want to reverse Rishi Sunak's national insurance rise. I think what she got wrong was trying to do too much too soon without bringing a range of people into her cabinet. Even Margaret Thatcher did that in her early days. But Rishi Sunak now, because he's there, ever since Boris Johnson bowed out of the Tory leadership contest, actually, over the weekend, the cost of government borrowing has fallen.
Liam, I'm going to just hold you there. We're seeing some blue lights on the Mall. We're going to return to this conversation with Liam Halligan in just a second, but I think we've got pictures now of a potential motorcade. Mark, what can you tell us?
Seeing now the blue lights that I think are the blue lights of the Special Escort Group and the other vehicles in the motorcade. In fact, I can hear the whistles. I'm just going to step to the side. This is one of the unusual things about the Special Escort Group. They don't use sirens, they use whistles, much more low-key, but still have the desired effect of getting traffic and members of the public out of the way to allow for this motorcade to pass. And there you see the vehicles, that convoy containing the Prime Minister-to-be, Rishi Sunak, as he heads down the Mall towards his appointment with King Charles III to accept that role as Prime Minister, to take on, as I say, the many challenges that he will now face as Prime Minister once he is appointed in the minutes ahead. That motorcade just rounding the Victoria Monument as it heads through the gates of Buckingham Palace for that appointment with King Charles.
Really, really interesting there. Still in those few moments where we do not have a Prime Minister, where executive authority rests with the King. I suppose it will only be a few moments' time until we get formal confirmation that the so-called kissing of hands has taken place. Not a literal kissing of hands in this instance, but a metaphor that has been used for hundreds of years when Rishi Sunak meets King Charles III. There we see the car has gone through those famous gates to Buckingham Palace now.
Right.
That meeting taking place very, very shortly, no doubt.
Yeah, just coming back to you, Liam, about Rishi Sunak. I mean, it is, fascinating that he has been able to kind of position himself as a kind of fiscal conservative, despite the fact that he has overseen the pandemic, when we have seen a historic intervention in the economy. I mean, what kind of things do you expect from a kind of Rishi Sunak premiership?
Yeah, so much of political coverage is about style rather than the actual numbers, isn't it? And of course, this is a Chancellor who oversaw £420 billion of spending during COVID, most of it financed by printed money. And yet when he comes in, as I was saying before we saw the pomp and ceremony there, since he's come in, since it's been clear he's going to be Prime Minister, financial markets have eased slightly. I mean, look, I've written lots and spoken lots about why markets are doing what they're doing. They're doing what they're doing mainly because of the energy price cap and the cost of it, and also because markets don't like the ignominy of Conservatives taking lumps out of each other. So they, sell the currency, frankly, rather than anything to do with the top rate of tax. So, of course, that's what the political class are lighted on. Just to go back, look, borrowing costs are coming down. They've come down, as I was saying, from about 4.2%. That's how much the governments must pay each year to borrow money for 10 years. It's sort of the lowest borrowing cost in the economy, down to about 3.7%, 3.8% now, which is a really big reduction. That should start to ripple through.
What did it peak at? Almost 6%?
No, this is not the mortgage rate. This is the 10-year gilt. It peaked at about 4.2%, 4.3%. So it's come down a lot, and that should ripple through into mortgages. So if you are looking to remortgage, or if you are looking to get a mortgage, as the days go by now, those mortgage rates are getting cheaper, and it's worth keeping an eye on that. The other thing I wanted to highlight, again, it's a huge contrast to the pomp and ceremony on the Mall, which the Brits do so well, of course. I wanted to highlight some of the real cost of living that's going on in this country, the real inflation numbers. Now, we know that the headline rate of inflation is 10.1%. So the ONS is telling us that it's 10.1% more expensive now to live in September 2022 than it was in September 2021. I've often said on GB News that to many people, that's a sick joke. It's actually a lot more. And if we can bring my graphic up now, the Office for National Statistics has brought out some numbers showing the cost of basic foodstuffs. Maybe the graphic isn't available, but I'll just tell you the numbers. So
I think I'll just interrupt you just for 1 second to let the audience know that Rishi Sunak has now entered the room with the King. It is now just the Prime Minister-to-be and King Charles III together in a room. No clue as to what they're talking about. Of course, a private conversation, but just to let the audience know there, the King and the Prime Minister-to-be are meeting as we speak.
I'd say, Tom, this is absolutely what GB News is about. Here we are, you're talking over pictures of Buckingham Palace, right? Telling people about the pomp and the ceremony, and I'm here talking about what I'm about to talk about now, which is the price of tea, right? Because the price of tea over the last year, the ONS says inflation is just 10.1%. The price of tea is actually up 46%.
Wow.
OK? Wow. It's up 46%. The price of pasta, which many families, we eat loads of pasta at my place because my kids eat so much, right? But a lot of families will use pasta because pasta is a very high nutrition, very cheap food that you can store. You don't need to put it in the fridge and all the rest of it. But of course, pasta's made from wheat. Wheat comes from Russia and Ukraine, the major wheat exporters. The price of wheat over the last year, it's up by 60%. And the price of vegetable oil, which of course is sunflower oil, Ukraine's the biggest exporter, rapeseed oil, they're all combined into vegetable oils.
Yeah.
And again, it's a key ingredient, not least for cafes and households. That's up 65%.
So what can
These make
Rishi
a mockery
Sunak now?
of the headline inflation numbers that we hear about so much.
So what can Rishi Sunak now do practically as Prime Minister? Does a tough line on Ukraine help here? Does a spending restraint work here? What politically does Rishi Sunak need to do to try and ease this burden people are seeing?
He's going to need to... you wouldn't start from here, would you? It's a very difficult situation he's inheriting. It's got very little to do with Liz Truss, actually. The situation he's inheriting has got everything to do with the last 10 years of ultra-loose monetary policy, massive money printing around the world, ultra-low interest rates, which have really let the inflation cat out of the bag, if you like. I do think we are going to see some spending constraints. I do think he's going to have to take on some of the public sector trade unions to not impose 10% pay increases, which is what many of them will be calling for at the time when private sector people will be getting wage increases, if any, that are far, far less. But I think the main thing he needs to do is engender confidence. And I still have real concerns about increasing the corporation tax from 19 to 25%. There are some exemptions, but a lot of small and medium-sized companies, they will be absolutely hammered out of existence after the combination of lockdown and now a 6% reduction in their margin when they operate on thin margins anyway.
No, really, really interesting stuff there. Liam Halligan, thank you so much for bringing it to us. No doubt we'll be returning to you throughout as what we're going to see is a very economic premiership, I think.
Yeah.
It's interesting, though, what might Rishi Sunak be discussing now with the King? Because, of course, there's something coming up in about 2 weeks going on in Egypt, and that's COP27. COP26, of course, hosted in Glasgow last year. Obviously, King Charles, well, then Prince Charles, went along there.
And he was very at the forefront at that time.
He certainly was. And then there was political contention as to whether or not Liz Truss would sort of be going or whether the King should go. Potentially, that's an element of discussion now between the new Prime Minister and the King.
Well, and apparently he's decided he won't be going to COP this year, King Charles. And I think that may illuminate perhaps what kind of king he wants to be, because many people were worried that he had taken a previously much more political line before he became king. And maybe he will be following in the footsteps of the late Queen Elizabeth.
Although there were some cheeky suggestions, perhaps, that Downing Street might have had a hand to play in terms of whether or not the King might be going, and potentially a new Downing Street might have different ideas, different conversations, perhaps, with the palace. Yeah. Maybe Rishi Sunak, with his image, at least, of being sort of more metropolitan, liberal, perhaps. Maybe he wants to be seen to be more green than Liz Truss was worried about.
Yeah, no, and he has mentioned in the past, Rishi Sunak has talked about wanting to secure the future of the planet for his children and so on. So whereas Liz Truss, it's gone very forward when it comes to fracking and other of the energy technologies that some environmentalists have opposed. And potentially that may be a rift within the Conservative Party, as fracking was in the last couple of weeks. But, Liz Truss, there was this kind of spout of optimism in the first few days, and that rapidly declined. And I wonder, as the British public, we often have a lot of goodwill for the first few days and then, react quite strongly. So maybe we're in this very short, brief moment for Rishi Sunak where there is a sense, OK, finally there may be a sense of direction. But whether or not that will sustain in a matter of days, potentially, could be quite significant.
It did used to be the case that these meetings with Her Majesty the Queen, with Her late Majesty, were a bit shorter than these meetings with King Charles III. I remember I've sat through far too many changes of Prime Ministers for my young age, to be honest, but they were always a little bit quicker when it was with the late Queen. The session between Liz Truss and Charles III seem to have lasted a very long time, which means that this one between the new Prime Minister and indeed the new King may well last long too, meaning that we might well be sort of slipping back on our timescale. We were expecting Rishi Sunak to speak from Downing Street at 11:35. That may now be a little bit later, of course, all of this vague timing. But yes, something to think about there in terms of the length of conversation going on inside the palace.
Well, let's now talk to former Conservative Party chairman, Lord Pickles, who should be joining us just in a moment.
I think he might be there. I think we may well be staying on the image of Buckingham Palace, so unfortunately we won't see Lord Pickles, but I do believe you are there. First of all, what does a government under Rishi Sunak look like, in your view? Of course, you served in previous governments when you were sitting in the Commons. What does a Rishi Sunak premiership look like, in your view?
Well, we've got to wait and see. He's got some difficult things he needs to tackle. He needs to get himself a balanced cabinet. He needs to ensure that Downing Street ceases to be dysfunctional. It's been dysfunctional now for 3 prime ministers. He needs to ensure that next Monday's a great success. He needs to tell us what he stands for and what his government stands for, and he needs to get the Conservative Party members of Parliament in some kind of order and to drop this rather ridiculous whipping that we've seen and get people behind him.
Yeah, on that point, Lord Pickles, I mean, that was something that defined the very short premiership of Liz Truss, the division and conflicts within the Tory party. And many of the MPs that we've been speaking to over the last couple of days have said that actually this has been the most unified that they felt of the Parliamentary Conservative Party in weeks, and Rishi Sunak can sit on the confidence that he had the majority of the Parliamentary Conservative Party. Are we going to now see a move away from everything viewed through the lens of the internal wranglings of the Tory party and focus again on policy for the country, in your view?
Yes, I mean, it's noticeable that the tension has dropped in both chambers, and that people now are hoping we can get to the business of serving the British people. It's a strange thing, you know, when various members of Parliament are, you know, disrespecting other members of Parliament. But I think if we don't show some kind of unity, the electorate will punish us and punish us severely.
Now, Lord Pickles, you're well known as someone who I suppose might be described as a working class Conservative, someone who originally didn't come from a Labour supporting, didn't come from a Tory supporting background. You're someone who has sort of built their way up in life. For your sort of strand of conservatism, some might say blue-collar conservatism, how does that sit with the richest man in Parliament becoming Prime Minister?
Well, one thing that's taught me, I've never looked down my nose just because someone's got a bob or two. And I think you've got to see whether he's any good at the job, and I'm confident that he will be very good at the job. You know, we shouldn't despise somebody just because they've got money. In the same, we shouldn't despise somebody that's on benefits. Everybody's entitled to be treated with respect, and everybody's entitled to be given a chance to do the job to the best of their ability.
And just on that point about, you know, Rishi Sunak focusing on the country at large, hopefully. I mean, there seems to be some confusion about the meaning of the 2019 manifesto and why the Conservatives won. Some people saying it was because of Boris and his popularity. Some arguing that actually it was a much more kind of small C, low tax manifesto than has been let on. Whereas others, as we've discussed today, actually think it was much more about interventionism, Brexit, and you know, transforming the economy in the interests of so-called left-behind communities. On that sense of what Rishi Sunak should be doing in terms of policy, what do you think that is?
Well, I think the most important thing to recognise, and I come speaking from someone who was born in Yorkshire, is that if you're going to level up, you can't level up a region as a whole. You've got to really target those areas of deprivation and poverty. You know, take a place like Manchester, which is a very wealthy city, and yet with a short walk of the city centre, there'll be people that are totally alienated from the improvement that's occurred in Manchester. You need to include those communities, and those communities often lack communications, they often lack skills, they often lack opportunity, and most of all, they lack monuments to success. So to be successful, it isn't about a number of grand projects, you know, improving Leeds, improving Manchester. You've got to ensure that the towns around them and the communities around them are also improved and seen to enjoy prosperity.
Well, Lord Pickles, thank you so much for your perspective this morning on GB News. We really, really appreciate it. And no doubt we don't have long to wait to see what indeed Mr Sunak's cabinet will start to look like. Well, let's turn to Downing Street now, where our political editor, Darren McCaffrey, is for us, and we will be able to see pictures from Downing Street very, very shortly. Let's head there in a second, because I do want to talk about one of the less remarked moments on days like these, perhaps one of the more trivial moments on days like these, indeed, what the different lecterns of our different prime ministers may look like. Interestingly, since Gordon Brown, every new prime minister has had a new lectern. Let's take a little look at what what Gordon Brown's spindly little lectern looked like. I believe we've got some pictures for those watching on television. We can see Gordon Brown wheeled out the spindliest of little lecterns. There it is. It's sort of metal. It looks like it comes from a sort of primary school, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's pretty.
It's a very
small.
peculiar one. But after Gordon Brown came David Cameron, of course. And Cameron's lectern was an entirely different affair. You can see the big swoop there. It's a swoopy,
like a
strong. It's almost conical in its design, but yes, very Cameroon. It's my favourite, incidentally, of all the lecterns to come. Theresa May's replaced it, and Theresa May's, look at how thin that is. It's spindly. Some might say it's a weak and wobbly lectern in the style of Theresa May. You know how some people say
Maybe
owners...
they do reflect their...
It's like dogs and their owners, isn't it? It's lecterns and their prime ministers. But after Theresa May, Boris Johnson, of course, came. And look at his, it's again back to a sturdy one. This looks like something it's out of the White House press briefing room. And one of the reasons it's wide, apparently, is that Boris Johnson loves to thump the lectern when he speaks and didn't want to break it. So that was Boris Johnson's. And then, briefly, Liz Truss had this peculiar affair, which we'll be able to see now. It looks like something that's made out of Jenga. Look at that, spindly and spinning round. Well, I understand that a new lectern might well have popped out on to Downing Street. Darren McCaffrey is there for us. Darren, what can you tell us about Rishi Sunak's potential lectern?
Well, I can tell you, first of all, Tom, it's not terribly tall, which is maybe not a surprise, given the size of our incoming Prime Minister. Yes, well, first of all, let me just talk about Liz Truss's one first, which I think initially she wants to be made out of different trees representing the different four nations of the United Kingdom, which is going to run into quite a substantial sum of money, and they ultimately, in the end, said we're not prepared to pay that, but she get that rather odd one that looked a bit like a Jenga kind of game almost, if you like. Felt, though, that it could collapse at any stage if you pulled out one of the pieces. That, however, has now gone. I'm not entirely sure where it's going to end up. Maybe a bit like the United States, we could have a museum of Prime Minister's podiums in the future. I don't know whether we can show you the wider shots of Downing Street, because that's the only way you're going to be able to see the new podium, because the new one is on the street at the moment. There it is, the big reveal. And what would I say? It's a lot lighter. It's not quite as sturdy, I would suggest, as the one that Boris Johnson had, but it's certainly
it's like a halfway house between Boris Johnson and Theresa May.
Gordon Brown's was, or indeed Theresa May. So a pretty solid podium, I would say, that the new incoming Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has selected. It is this rather odd thing, as you say, this odd tradition that started in the last 15 years or so, that Prime Ministers get to decide on their own lectern. I suppose it does kind of make sense in the sense that they are all different sizes and shapes, and ultimately it needs to work for them, but it does travel around with them. That was the odd thing about this, is that, you know, Liz Truss' lectern, for example, was used at a party conference speech in Birmingham, so it does also travel with the Prime Minister.
It's interesting looking at the frontage of this particular lectern. It's almost set back. All of the others that we've seen had a sort of very flat front. I wonder if we can go back to the picture of that lectern in front of that shining door, because it looks like it's sort of set back. There's almost a shelf within it, which is a peculiar little detail. And also, yes, as Darren, you were saying, it's not spindly, but it's not exactly sturdy either. I don't know, can we read into anything about the face of this lectern? Is it a modern lectern? Is it a traditional lectern?
I don't think we can, Tom, because those are shots that we do not, or pictures we do not control. But yes, there is a little inset into it. All I would say, though, and it's interesting actually, it's notable, I hadn't noticed before until we'd shown those pictures of Theresa May, that the actual crest representing Downing Street, it wasn't on her podium, it had been on all the others. Again, though, that is a relatively, I'm not suggesting the crest itself is relatively recent, but its placing in official documentation and on the podium, or the lectern, is a relatively recent one.
I think I can answer that question about
that I think it only really came up with David Cameron.
I can answer that question about the crest because in 2017, when there wasn't a crest on the podium, when Theresa May went out to call that election, that's because it was a party thing rather than a government thing. So sometimes they do take the crest off the podium, depending on whether this is something that could be seen as a party matter or a government matter. We're just seeing some pictures now of the Mall, where I believe we may well be able to see another motorcade. It may well be very, very soon that we see Rishi Sunak head back down. I don't think we can see any outriders there on the Mall quite yet. But Darren McCaffrey, what do you expect Rishi Sunak will actually be saying at that new lectern of his in a few moments' time?
Well, I suspect it will be a speech that is a little longer than the one that we had yesterday at Conservative Party headquarters that lasted, I think, for around 83 seconds. I think there will be a reflection to a large degree of the difficult situation the country finds itself in. There is no doubt that this is a Prime Minister facing an incredibly difficult task, potentially the greatest in-tray of difficulties since the end of the Second World War. There are almost fires in every department that he's going to have to try and put out, whether that is the economic instability, the big decisions on departmental spending, the possibility of tax rises, whether it is war on the continent of Europe that could escalate at any stage, listening to what is emanating from the Kremlin, whether it is the real concern this winter about the NHS and its ability to cope, not just with the normal crises that we see, but also potentially with the return of COVID and a bad flu season. As I say, it is, you could talk about what's going to happen with the future of the United Kingdom too, with this push by Nicola Sturgeon and the SNP to try and hold a second referendum. What I'm trying to demonstrate here, Tom, is that you could almost go through every single government department and find some really deep-seated, really serious issues that Rishi Sunak is going to have to address. And in the end, he is going to, I think, talk about those challenges, be pretty frank with the British public when he speaks in what we reckon in about 10 minutes' time or so. We will also hear, I think, about trying to bring the party and the country together. We heard that yesterday, the words of unity quite a lot. Because in the end, that is something that he is going to have to try and do, is try and bring particularly the Conservative Party together, given the infighting that we've seen over the last year or so. And also humility. Again, another word, and integrity he touched upon. I think these are going to be his watchwords for his premiership, in the sense that what he will want to emphasise, maybe distance himself from one of his former bosses, i.e. Boris Johnson, that he will talk about he will be a humble Prime Minister and one that will demonstrate integrity.
And we're just waiting for Rishi Sunak to come out of Buckingham Palace. But on that point, you listed some of the challenges. that he is going to be facing. We were just talking a moment ago about whether or not we initially begin with a sense of optimism and goodwill, but then the kind of reality comes crashing down very soon after. I mean, is there a sense that Rishi Sunak has the kinds of leadership and the ability to rise to the types of challenges, the range of them that you mentioned going forward?
Yeah, I think that it's quite difficult in some ways to measure that. First of all, he has been Chancellor of the Exchequer, a pretty big job, and a very, very big job at a very, very difficult time, i.e. during the pandemic. He only came into office a month before the pandemic properly started here in the UK, and a month before having to make those massive decisions when it came to furlough. Now, in some ways, they were easy decisions in the sense that they did just chuck the kitchen sink at things. So he has got that political experience, but he has only been an MP for 7 years. He's not served in any other government department. Being Prime Minister is very, very different from being Chancellor, and these will be very, very testing times. Though those that know him say that he is a formidable character, he is very, very capable. I don't think anyone would doubt that he's very, very bright. Is he a great communicator? Well, you look yesterday at that speech. It wasn't great, it was a bit wooden, a bit like the podium in many regards. He will have to get better at that, and the tests begin almost immediately, Anaya. This afternoon, he is going to have to appoint a new cabinet, a cabinet that's going to have to do what he says it is, which is to unify the party, and that means incorporating people from across the different factions of the Conservative Party. He seems determined not to make the mistakes, frankly, that Boris Johnson and Liz Truss did, which is appoint simply loyalists, and that means there will be people inside the cabinet who may well fundamentally disagree with some of the big decisions that the Prime Minister makes. We also know tomorrow there's going to be Prime Minister's question time, his first time at the dispatch box up against Keir Starmer in that very combative arena. Again, that will be another immediate test.
Darren, I'm just going to interrupt you there because we now have confirmation that we can call Rishi Sunak the Prime Minister. Rishi Sunak has now been appointed by the King as Prime Minister. It was just over 30 minutes that this country had no Prime Minister at all, but now we do have our first British Asian Prime Minister and indeed our fifth Prime Minister
and first
of the last 6 years, and indeed first Hindu Prime Minister as well.
And this is an historic moment, Tom, in the sense that we have got our 57th Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, following what the tenure of the shortest serving Prime Minister ever, but we have one of our youngest ever Prime Ministers, Rishi Sunak, who is now the new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, has entered office at the age of 42. He is younger than David Cameron was, younger than Tony Blair was. He's only been an MP, he has to say, for 7 years. That is one of the quickest transitions to the top of government, to the ultimate power in government that we've ever seen in this country. As I say, he's the youngest since 1812. You have to go back to Lord Liverpool more than 200 years ago to find a younger Prime Minister. And then, even then, it was only just. He's also the first non-white leader of this country, the first one of Indian heritage. And that is a big moment for the United Kingdom, I think, to a large degree. And you have to look at the remarks, actually, of world leaders. Joe Biden, the US president, last night. You know, for many, this is an outward sign of the changing face of Britain, about how this country has changed in the last couple of decades. But also, this is another notable thing about Rishi Sunak, is he is also one of the wealthiest, if not the wealthiest Prime Minister this country has ever had. Yeah. I think someone remarked he may be the first Prime Minister who's wealthier than the King himself, or certainly his family is, which is quite incredible. And that will be an Achilles heel, though, to a degree, I think, for Rishi Sunak. He's already got into trouble, didn't he, previously when he was Chancellor, about his tax issues and his family's tax issues. The Labour Party will use this, I think, as a beating stick. Now, many people say it should not matter. I know you were just talking to Eric Pickles. He argues, you know, someone's private wealth shouldn't matter in the decisions that they make. You judge someone on different merits. But it was interesting. I saw a kind of an opinion poll taken yesterday about the words that come to people's minds when they think of Rishi Sunak. And there were lots of good words like competent and intelligent and capable. There were bad words like snake and traitor. But the biggest word by far was rich. And so I think lots of the public out there simply view this man as a very, very wealthy man. And for some of I think, voters out there, that could be a negative. And I think Rishi Sunak's going to have to balance that quite carefully. But an historic moment for Britain. Our new Prime Minister about to leave Buckingham Palace to travel here to Downing Street and to address the nation for the first time as PM in the next couple of minutes.
Well, Darren, thank you for that. We will return to you very, very shortly, no doubt. But as you mentioned there, Buckingham Palace is where the action is currently. Let's go to our royal reporter, Cameron Walker, who is standing outside Buckingham Palace, where, of course, the new Prime Minister has just been formally appointed by the King. Cameron, what have we learned about what went on inside Buckingham Palace?
Yes, Tom. Well, the new Prime Minister is still inside the building of Buckingham Palace here, and we've heard via a press association or an agency source that the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, is indeed now the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. We are awaiting a statement from Buckingham Palace for official confirmation on that, but we now can call him Prime Minister. King Charles III's second Prime Minister of his very short reign so far, of course, only just under 7 weeks into the job of our sovereign. He is the leader of the Conservative Party, of course, Rishi Sunak. He commands the majority of seats within the House of Commons and therefore commands the confidence of the House of Commons. So we are expecting in the next couple of minutes the new Prime Minister to depart Buckingham Palace and travel down the Mall to Downing Street. The speech he was expected to deliver outside number 10 Downing Street was expected for 11:35. By my watch, it's now 11:36, so perhaps things are slightly delayed. We don't know exactly how long the audience the King had with Rishi Sunak, but perhaps it is longer than we have seen in the past when Her Majesty the Queen did similar audiences. But for now, we await Rishi Sunak to depart from Buckingham Palace. Of course, we've got that state visit with the South African president next month. No doubt the new Prime Minister will be heavily involved in that and supporting His Majesty the King and Queen Consort host the South African head of state. And then in May next year, we have King Charles III's coronation. Again, something Buckingham Palace and Rishi Sunak's government will be collaborating on a lot.
I was just wondering, what can we read into the idea that these are perhaps longer audiences than we were used to? Is this a sign of a king who perhaps has more opinions than his predecessor?
Well, of course, Tom, as monarch, he has to remain politically neutral, His Majesty the King. And I think in the last 6 weeks or so, we have seen he's very much going to be following in his mother's footsteps and sticking to that pledge and not becoming too political, certainly not in public at least. In private, perhaps, of course, it's the King's responsibility to advise and guide the government of the day, and no doubt he will be doing that to Rishi Sunak. But Rishi Sunak, as Prime Minister, is in charge of the government and the policy. It is the King's role to give royal assent to whichever policy the government puts forward. So in that sense, I don't think we're going to be seeing anything perhaps too political from His Majesty the King. I think he's very much aware of his constitutional role and constitutional responsibilities, but perhaps he just is more kind of interested in the government of the day. And of course, it's been such a turbulent time over the last 6 weeks or so. Of course, we had the death of Her Majesty the Queen, the national mourning period, but now, of course, we're having our second Prime Minister in the space of under 2 months. So, of course, the King is perhaps concerned about the state of the politics in this country, and he'll be looking to Rishi Sunak to see if he can turn it around.
And on that point about the kind of turmoil that Britain has been facing politically over the last few weeks, I guess for many international observers, when the late Queen passed, they were interested in a lot of the ritual and the pompous. And in many ways, this kind of highlights the role of the monarchy, that sense of continuity in the face of the political upheavals that we've experienced over the last few weeks.
Well, exactly. On the eve of Her Majesty the Queen's funeral, there was a big reception here at Buckingham Palace for world leaders who had travelled to the United Kingdom to be at the Queen's funeral. And one of the perhaps important roles of the monarchy is representing the United Kingdom abroad and commanding that respect of the United Kingdom on the world stage. And in the absence of any kind of functioning government, as perhaps some people would argue over the last couple of months, that the monarchy has been that continuity, that stability, which the United Kingdom and many people in the United Kingdom are craving at the moment. And I think perhaps we'll see King Charles and the new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, continue that stability in the months and perhaps years to come as well.
No, indeed. I mean, what can we expect? I mean, we were just discussing earlier about what kind of king Charles is going to be and whether or not he will be following in the footsteps of the late Queen Elizabeth. I mean, COP27 is coming up this year, and he is perhaps deciding not to express himself in the way that he may have previously done on environmental issues. Is this kind of what we're going to see going forward, him taking a less forefront role on some of these more contentious political issues, do you think?
Well, if you remember at COP26 last year in Glasgow, the King, then Prince of Wales, delivered a speech where he said we need to be on and I quote, warlike footing to tackle the climate crisis. Some commentators saw that as perhaps too political. And from my understanding, if he was still the Prince of Wales at this time, he was expected to travel to Egypt to COP27. But under Liz Truss's administration, it was decided in collaboration between Buckingham Palace and the government, as we understand it, that it would not be perhaps appropriate for the new king to travel to Egypt for COP27 for what would have been his first foreign tour as our sovereign. So that was the collective decision that was made. As for being too political, as I said earlier, I think perhaps King Charles, although he is still going to be very much concerned for the environment and will always champion the causes which he and his oldest son, the Prince of Wales, will continue to champion in terms of climate change, wildlife conservation, like his father, Prince Philip, did. He is very much aware that as the monarch, he has to be very politically neutral, and perhaps he will be delegating a lot of those climate speeches to his son, the Prince of Wales, in the years to come. But perhaps Rishi Sunak, we don't know, will have a change of heart compared to Liz Truss's government in terms of how the king is deployed on the world stage to perhaps influence the UK government's position on certain issues such as climate change.
Yes, that's a really, really key point, that it's the collaboration between Downing Street and Buckingham Palace on this issue. Potentially, we might see a U-turn, or well, I suppose, can you describe it as a U-turn if it's a new government? But a change in direction, perhaps, from the previous policy. Perhaps we will see the king going off to Egypt after all.
Perhaps, Tom, although I doubt it, and I think it's more for operational reasons more than anything else. The King's diary and the then Prince of Wales' diary is planned months and months in advance, and I think such a last-minute change now, it would have to be for something particularly important, and I think perhaps King Charles even, will be very much wanting to focus on his role as king. And as I said, it was decided that it perhaps would not be appropriate for King Charles to have his first overseas visit to Egypt, to Sharm el-Sheikh, for the COP27 climate conference. There were rumours perhaps that his first visit would be to one of the European nations, France or Germany perhaps, to shore up support for Britain following Brexit. But this all remains unconfirmed. We also saw last week, in fact, that the New South Wales government in Australia is expecting a royal tour there in 2024 to coincide with their 200th anniversary of their parliament. So they're clearly expecting King Charles to be there in 2024. From my understanding from speaking to royal sources, nothing has been confirmed and everything is still on the table, and they are still in talks with the foreign governments. But of course, one of King Charles's big challenges at the moment is shoring up support for the Commonwealth. He still remains head of state in 14 other realms and territories outside the United Kingdom. So I think that perhaps is going to be his main priority, his main focus abroad, rather than attending a climate conference.
Yes. Well, Cameron, thank you so much for bringing us all of that extra royal updates there outside Buckingham Palace as we wait for the Prime Minister now, as we can formally call him, to leave that famous building. Let's go to Mark White now, who is just a little bit further down the road on the Mall. Mark, soon the motorcade of the new Prime Minister will be whizzing past you. But one of the things that will be in the new Prime Minister's in-tray is, frankly, the security of the nation. What has he got to contend with?
Yes, you're absolutely right. On the motorcade, first of all, noticing that the police are getting just a little bit more aware of the situation around them. So I would expect that in the next minute or two that motorcade is going to come up the mile. So I'll get out of the way, give you a much more interesting shot than just me. And on the security of the United Kingdom, you're absolutely right. There is a war raging in Europe at the moment, in Ukraine. It's getting ever more tense. The economic ramifications, as well as the political and global stability ramifications, are very significant at the moment. That is, without a doubt, a top priority of the new Prime Minister Rishi Sunak as he begins his first day in office, as well as having to deal with that global economic crisis, much of it brought about by that war raging in Ukraine. And then more domestically, of course, what to do about the thousands of people crossing the English Channel on a daily basis. We're up to 38,000 now, 10,000 more than crossed the English Channel in the whole of last year. Suella Braverman, when she took over, very briefly said she would get on top of it. Priti Patel as well, but Priti Patel, Suella Braverman were able to do nothing about it. The numbers have just continued to grow.
Mark, I'm going to interrupt you there because we can see the motorcade of the new Prime Minister just leaving the gates of Buckingham Palace there, swinging round that famous entrance to Buckingham Palace, and he'll be turning down the National Mall there. We can see the motorcade there of the new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, just passing Mark White on the map. Mark.
Yes, the motorcade, as I say, passing now, heading up the usual route, of course, up the Mall, and then just as they get towards the end of the Mall there, they'll turn down, probably down Horse Guards and into the back entrance of Downing Street there, where Rishi Sunak will make that all-important first address as Prime Minister to the nation, where he will set out his policy priorities, the steady hand on the tiller that has been called for, of course, not just by the markets, but through many in his own party after that very short tenure by Liz Truss. So really within a couple of minutes now, we can expect that Rishi Sunak will be heading to the position where our political editor Darren McCaffrey is, to give that all-important first speech there. And then we'll get into the look of his new cabinet. Will it be a cabinet of all the talents? Will he be going to all of those different areas of government that may well be opposed to him, but it's much more inclusive, perhaps, than the cabinet of Liz Truss and Boris Johnson before them.
Well, thank you, Mark. Let's see if we can now go to Downing Street itself, where our political editor Darren McCaffrey is. Hopefully we'll be able to speak to Darren in just a second, where we are expecting the motorcade of the new Prime Minister to arrive imminent.
Yeah, very good afternoon, or almost afternoon, I should say. We are running a little bit behind schedule, but it is still the morning, coming up to 10 to 12, isn't it, on this Tuesday morning. And I think it's important, Tom, sometimes, isn't it, about all the politics and the protocol to step back and think, you know, this is a moment in history. We are about to see the 57th Prime Minister of the United Kingdom address the nation in front of that famous black door. It is a very short drive from Buckingham Palace to Downing Street. In fact, the police at the other end of the street are just opening the gates, which is a sign that the Prime Minister is about to arrive momentarily. This is a man who grew up in Southampton. He was the son of pharmacists, the son of someone who their parents fought him to get into Winchester College, one of the best schools in the country. He then went to Oxford, to Stanford. He is undoubtedly a very bright and intelligent guy, a man who has managed to ascend to the highest office in the land after being only an MP for 7 years, having served as Chancellor of the Exchequer during the pandemic. A man, though, that many dislike for resigning and effectively helping to bring down the premiership of Boris Johnson. But he is arriving now into Downing Street as the new Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Rishi Sunak, one of the youngest Prime Ministers this country has seen in a very, very long time, since 1812. He is Britain's first non-white Prime Minister. He is a very wealthy man too, but he will stand and address the nation now as a Prime Minister dealing with a country in some of the most difficult circumstances this country has seen in generations. And here he is now walking up the streets to address the British nation. Very good afternoon, Prime Minister. Let's have a listen to what the new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has to say as he addresses the UK for the first time as PM.
Good morning. I've just been to Buckingham Palace and accepted His Majesty the King's invitation to form a government in his name. It is only right to explain why I'm standing here as your new Prime Minister. Right now, our country is facing a profound economic crisis. The aftermath of COVID still lingers. Putin's war in Ukraine has destabilized energy markets and supply chains the world over. I want to pay tribute to my predecessor, Liz Truss. She was not wrong to want to improve growth in this country. It is a noble aim. And I admired her restlessness to create change. But some mistakes were made. Ooh. Not born of ill will or bad intentions. Quite the opposite, in fact. But mistakes nonetheless. And I have been elected as leader of my party and your Prime Minister, in part, to fix them. And that work begins immediately. I will place economic stability and confidence at the heart of this government's agenda. This will mean difficult decisions to come. But you saw me during COVID doing everything I could to protect people and businesses with schemes like furlough. There are always limits, more so now than ever. But I promise you this, I will bring that same compassion to the challenges we face today. The government I lead will not leave the next generation, your children and grandchildren, with a debt to settle that we were too weak to pay ourselves. I will unite our country, not with words, but with action. I will work day in and day out to deliver for you. This government will have integrity, professionalism, and accountability at every level. Trust is earned, and I will earn yours. I will always be grateful to Boris Johnson for his incredible achievements as Prime Minister, and I treasure his warmth and generosity of spirit. And I know he would agree that the mandate my party earned in 2019 is not the sole property of any one individual. It is a mandate that belongs to and unites all of us. And the heart of that mandate is our manifesto. I will deliver on its promise: a stronger, NHS, better schools, safer streets, control of our borders, protecting our environment, supporting our armed forces, levelling up and building an economy that embraces the opportunities of Brexit, where businesses invest, innovate and create jobs. I understand how difficult this moment is. After the billions of pounds it cost us to combat COVID, after all the dislocation that caused, in the midst of a terrible war that must be seen successfully to its conclusions, I fully appreciate how hard things are. And I understand too that I have work to do to restore trust after all that has happened. All I can say is that I am not daunted. I know the high office I have accepted, and I hope to live up to its demands. But when the opportunity to serve comes along, you cannot question the moment, only your willingness. So I stand here before you, ready to lead our country into the future, to put your needs above politics, to reach out and build a government that represents the very best traditions of my party. Together, we can achieve incredible things. We will create a future worthy of the sacrifices so many have made, and fill tomorrow and every day thereafter with hope. Thank you.
The first speech from our new Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, having arrived from Buckingham Palace a few minutes ago as the third Premier in 2 months, and a different lectern, which is being moved away compared to the speech we heard from Liz Truss earlier. Liz Truss speaking for just 3 minutes, 7 seconds. Rishi Sunak speaking for far longer than that.
And we're used to seeing new Prime Ministers enter the black door that we see on the screen with their family, with their spouses, but Rishi Sunak standing alone outside number 10 Downing Street. When he walks through that door, he will be greeted by the staff inside. He knows he has big economic challenges ahead. He said mistakes were made under the premiership of Liz Truss and warned all of us that there are difficult decisions to come. There he goes to meet the staff where they will applaud him. That is the tradition as a new Prime Minister walks through the black door.
And then, of course, the work begins to form his new cabinet and to try and establish that economic stability and competence at the heart of government that he spoke about. Olivia Utley, our political reporter, with us in the studio. And clearly he's setting out a different direction to the Truss, I'm going to say the Truss years, Truss months, of course, and talking about mistakes being made, not acknowledged by Liz Truss in her speech.
No, he spoke very boldly there about the mistakes that were made. All in all, it felt like he was prioritising honesty. He wanted to speak openly and directly to the country. He mentioned compassion, which I think is very important, because there are plenty of people who say that whatever the Tories do now, as long as they do it with the compassion, they stand a chance of winning the next general election. I think what was really interesting to me is that it was not just very different from what we've seen from Liz Truss. It was a very different speech from the Rishi Sunak that we saw over the summer. He was very contrite here. He sounded humble. The fact that his wife speech, it was open and honest and direct to the country. It seemed almost sort of mournful. And over the summer, we saw a Rishi Sunak who was sort of prepared to be a bit bolshy. He talked over Liz Truss a bit. He was criticised for that. He was very slick. This is a different sort of Prime Minister altogether. It felt very much like tough times. I'm the tough man. Yeah. I'm here to do the job. I'm going to get on with it quietly, keep my head down. It was a chastened man.
Yeah, I appreciate how difficult this is. I fully appreciate how hard things are. Clearly recognising what's going to come around the corner pretty soon.
Yeah, it felt like he was warning the nation about what comes next. And I think Liz Truss got quite a lot of criticism for not really doing that. I mean, it was clear to many people in the country that she was taking over the reins at an almost impossible time. But she didn't really allude to that. She was all about, you know, the sunlit uplands, bigger, better Britain, growth, etc. And there weren't enough pointers made to just how difficult a position she finds herself in. And that meant that she quite quickly eroded quite a lot of political capital. I think at the beginning people felt as though, well, whatever she does, it'll be better than the mess we're in now, very low expectations. But she raised her expectations. Rishi Sunak here on his first day is already talking about just how difficult the situation is. And I think that'll be very important.
And he said he's got to unite the party. He warned his MPs yesterday that they must unite or the party would die. But actually, even though it must be a moment of extraordinary pride when you walk through that door, your party is willing you to do better and to improve their fortunes, but actually today you choose your top team and you start making enemies as soon as you do that.
Well, absolutely. And I think what's so interesting about whatever Rishi Sunak does is he is going to make enemies. He is determined. From everyone I've spoken to, they say that, you know, unity is the top word for Rishi Sunak. He is determined to get Trussites, Johnsonites, his own loyal supporters